This week we're going to be talking about the sacrifice of Isaac. And last week, where did we leave off?
Yeah, we were talking about the birth of Isaac and basically Abraham's maybe poor treatment of the whole situation.
By poor treatment, you're referring to the treatment of Ishmael?
I am, yes.
Yeah.
About that. Because I know this is about the birth of Isaac, but a lot of this actually talked about Hagar and Ishmael. And how they were sent away and
into the desert
and close to death.
Yeah.
But we were lucky that God had his listening ears on and heard their cries.
Right. Or else they might have died of thirst. And then this week, we're going to do the entirety of chapter 22.
Nice.
All in one unit. Well, I think most people are kind of familiar with the sacrifice of Isaac. Let's just jump right into verse number 1.
Let's do it.
Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham, and he said, Abraham, and he said, here am I. I found this interesting because so far it seems like God tends to appear to Abraham in person. I think this is the first time where God speaks to Abraham, and it sounds more like Adam and Eve in the garden, where God's like,
yeah,
hey bro, what's up? And Abraham's like, I'm here. Yeah. What's up? What's the deal? Shout at me from heaven, as opposed to showing up as the angel of the Lord.
Yeah, that's right. That's what he's been doing.
Right. So my first inclination when I read this, other than the fact that the passage is referring to God as Elohim as opposed to Yahweh, is I feel like we're already starting out with a different flavor of the Elohist, starting the text out. So I'm already starting to expect to see some features that I would see within the edited text of the Elohist.
What is Elohist again?
The redactor or the editor that was part of the, we'll say the northern tribes, they favored the name Elohim for God.
Okay.
And you'll see lots of themes turn up in the Elohist texts that are more positive towards the tribes of Israel and are less focused on the tribe of Judah being, we'll say, special or significant. Let's move right into verse 2. Dan, can you read that?
Then he said, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. I thought Abraham had 2 sons. Your only son Isaac. That's a slap in the face there, isn't it?
Right.
What do you think that's about?
Well, I think it's obvious in the text that it's referring to one of 2 things. It's his only heir.
Okay.
So because he let the other one go,
right,
there's 2 now became 1. Because Hagar and Ishmael are no longer part of his household.
Yeah, but I mean, if Isaac died, Ishmael would still get everything, right?
No.
You can really disinherit somebody?
You can disinherit somebody, yep. That is a possibility.
That's cold.
It's pretty messed up. Yeah, and we talked about last week how troubling it was that Abraham just sent Hagar and Ishmael to die in the desert, basically with 1 skin of water.
Yeah.
And with no provisions. And it appears from the text that there's no property or no provisions or no inheritance. There is nothing for Ishmael. For all intents and purposes, Ishmael is no longer a son of Abraham. Now, there's another possibility, and if you talk to textual critics and people who really study the Abraham tradition, like Van Setters, they might suggest that, there was a northern tradition in which Abraham did only have 1 son. And the southern tradition, especially since that son came from an Egyptian maidservant, it's quite possible that the southern tradition and the northern tradition had an issue, and that is, in order to combine the 2 traditions, we had to get to a point where Abraham only had 1 son. So what do you do with the other son? You send them away. But it also makes sense of the fact that the Ishmaelites show up later in the Old Testament. The story of Ishmael does a number of things. It combines some of the southern traditions with the northern traditions, but it also explains why there are Ishmaelites floating around in the southern region and why they're associated with Egypt and how they're also related to the Israelites.
This is all going over my head.
Well, I just say all that to say this, that it is possible that the reason why Abraham has two sons, but now he only has one, was when they combined the two traditions together. They just needed to get rid of one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's possible that didn't happen?
Oh, it's possible that it didn't happen. It's also possible that everything happened exactly as it was written too. Obviously we have no way to know.
Right.
I'm just saying that there are probably multiple ways to look at it. A textual critic would say, well, it seems to me that this is a combination of northern and southern traditions, and the traditions probably had different sons for Abraham. And you'll see with Isaac too, there's a big emphasis in the coming chapters where Abraham is adamant that Isaac is absolutely not allowed to marry a Canaanite woman, which you wouldn't really hear that from the northern tribes. Northern tribes were a little more sympathetic because they lived more amongst the Canaanites.
Right. Okay.
They were more integrated into the Canaanite culture. So really heavy prohibitions against marrying Canaanites tend to show up in the Elohist texts, and then later, especially in the Deuteronomist texts.
Yeah, and for anybody watching who doesn't understand any of this, that's okay. Neither do I.
Anyways, they're just features from different time periods. But you're right. The phrasing, take your only son Isaac, seems out of place.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't flow very well, right? Yeah. I had the same thought. We both had questioned whether or not Moriah had any significance.
Mm-hmm.
And
what is that? There
are three possible identifications for Mount Moriah.
Mm-hmm.
The traditional interpretation, which Judaism holds, is that Mount Moriah was in modern-day Jerusalem. There's a second theory that it actually refers to the land of the Amorites, with the A being lost in history and translation, which seems to agree with the Septuagint. And then there's a third possibility that it's actually referring to Moreh, which is a location near Shechem. If it is indeed Moreh, then it is affiliated with Mount Gerizim, which is the holy mountain in the northern tribes as opposed to the southern tribes. So it's possible here that if we can conclude that this particular section of narrative came from the northern tribes, that possibly later, when Judah redacted the text, they changed Moreh to Mount Moriah so that it would be at God's mountain in Jerusalem rather than Gerizim, essentially robbing the text of its holy location.
Why would they do that?
Well, because it's a political document.
Oh.
Remember, the northern tribes got punished by God. That's why the Assyrians came in and exiled all of the northern tribes. The biblical rationale for that, of course, was because they were wicked and they followed the ways of the Canaanites. Okay. And naturally, the people who told us that are the people left over, which was Judah, which were always feuding with the northern tribes.
Yeah, I get that.
I think one could suggest there was probably some bias there. Yeah. Can you read 3 through 5?
So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. And he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, the lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you.
Right. So I was intrigued initially when I saw this passage, because it's not just Isaac and his father going to sacrifice. There's also 2 other young men with him. And I wonder, where they came from. Were they servants?
That's what I assumed.
Right? Because Hagar was not his only servant.
Right.
So they must have been other servants of the household. And I had a natural curiosity as to, whether or not they had a good or a negative relationship with Isaac.
Oh, okay.
Meaning, as we're about to find out, when Isaac is bound and nearly sacrificed, I'm curious how this would have been interpreted through the eyes of the servant boys who grew up in the household.
It says, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. So I don't know if they were able to see him or not.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. Whether or not the two young men with them were able to observe what was happening.
Yeah. I mean, if, I was told I'd have to sacrifice my child.
Right.
I probably wouldn't want anybody else to watch.
Yeah, that's a really good point. From the viewpoint of the two servants, Abraham walks off to make a sacrifice with his son.
Mm-hmm.
This is probably just another day for them.
Yeah.
They probably have no idea what's happening.
Yeah.
Right.
I believe that.
They're just there doing their job, tending to the donkey while they go yonder.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting that the English translation says worship.
Why?
Well, 'cause it's such a vague word, because worship seems to be an odd phrase for what's about to happen.
Well, not so odd if he's purposely trying to conceal his true motives.
Oh, that is an interesting thought. Because okay. First of all, if you're going to make a sacrifice and you have no sacrifice, the only thing you have with you is your son.
Right.
You wouldn't say, "Hey, I want to go make a sacrifice."
Right.
Because now you're maybe giving it up.
Mm-hmm.
You would have to say, "Well, we're going to go do a thing. We're going to go worship." Or the word they used here, which always gets translated worship, wanishtawa, is basically to bow down.
Okay.
And so translating it as worship is fine. It's still vague, but it's a fine translation. Nevertheless, you certainly wouldn't say, "Hey, we're going to go make a sacrifice, me and my only son, with no ram or animal with me."
And I mean, I think Abraham is no stranger to twisting the truth, right?
He does have a history of that, right? Oh, she's my sister.
Sort of.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, from a technical standpoint, sure, I guess she's your sister. But nevertheless, your point is very well taken. He does have a tendency to, you know what? Now that you bring it up, Abraham seems to have some level of rhetorical skill throughout the narrative. First, he convinces Sarah and others that, she's literally just my sister. So he's like, "I'm not lying. I'm just using words to my advantage."
Mm-hmm.
And then he talks God down from, maybe if I can find 50 righteous, or maybe 10, so he's able to whittle God down there. And now we see here he's going to sacrifice his own son. He's like, "We're just going to go worship." Wink. You know what I mean?
So you're saying he's very eloquent.
Yeah, it seems like maybe he uses words very well to his advantage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I believe that.
I keep seeing that's one trend I can pick up on. I don't know, anything else on this passage before we move into the sacrifice?
Yeah. I mean, I know we're saying he's twisting his words to his advantage, but he did say that they both would return.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And
right at the end.
Either he knew he wasn't actually going to kill his son, which seems less likely.
Right.
Or he just knew he better say that. We're going to go worship and then I will be back.
Right. Well, that was always, when I was in Catholic school, that was always the point of discussion, was that the fact that he planned to worship with his son, and he said that he would be back. And the fact that he went without an animal for the offering, but he told his son, God will provide the offering, which I don't know if we read that part yet.
I don't think so.
But nevertheless, Abraham throughout this narrative does appear for the first time ever to be displaying some level of faith. Like, no, God's gonna work this out. Like, I know he asked me to do the impossible.
Yeah.
But I have faith that God is going to find a way to make this not what it seems to be. The interesting thing about being asked to sacrifice his own son, and this is another reason why I feel like this text has such a northern flair to it, is because, for example, if you told me, Justin, God told me to tell you that you need to sacrifice your son, even if I believed that God told me to sacrifice my own son, I would never do it, because I grew up in a world in which child sacrifice is not in any way whatsoever at all ever tolerated. There is no way to justify sacrificing your child at all. However, we know that part of the northern territories of Palestine, especially up towards Phoenicia, there was practice of child sacrifice.
If God told you to sacrifice your child, you wouldn't do it?
No.
If you knew it was God?
Never.
If you knew it was God?
Nope. Send me to hell. Wouldn't do it.
Okay.
There's nothing you could do that would persuade me to harm my child. Nothing.
Okay.
I would go seek psychiatric treatment before I assumed God told me to kill my child.
Well, that's only because you know God is loving, right?
Well, that's the thing, and that's why the context here, I think, makes sense.
Yeah, because he's like, I know God is loving. He's telling me to do something bad. Obviously, he's got something up his sleeve.
Right.
That might actually be what it is.
Right. And again, going back to what we were saying about when I was in Catholic school, that was the prevailing view here, was that Abraham, for the first time, actually believed, no, God's got this one. Mm-hmm. Like, this is the first time Abraham really has faith in God.
Yeah.
Right. Nevertheless, the matter of child sacrifice, if he was from the tribe of Judah, a southern tribe, where the practice of child sacrifice wasn't really a thing in the Levantine region, I would imagine there would have been much discussion between him and God about, wait, what? You want me to do what? Why in the world would I sacrifice a child to you? That's insanity. That's wrong on every level. But in the northern territories, sacrificing your firstborn wasn't that crazy of an idea.
Well, why would people do that?
Well, it was just part of the religion.
What religion was that?
Well, ancient Canaanite religion. Now, it seems to have abated roughly around the time Abraham came on the scene.
Okay.
But we do have archaeological evidence that shows, especially up towards Phoenicia, that there were people, maybe not a lot of people, but there were people practicing child sacrifice. But nevertheless, I say all to say this. I think if the text is from the northern tribes, the matter of child sacrifice that makes sense to the story. But if the story is from the southern tribes, like Judah, and it was written by later scribes, like a Yahwist,
okay,
the idea that child sacrifice would be part of the patriarchal narrative seems odd to me. You know what I mean? And in fact, the only time Yahweh, shows up in the story is when it's time for Isaac to be rescued. Now, all of a sudden, the good God, not Elohim, but the good God, Yahweh, shows up.
Okay, so it uses the different God language, right?
Yeah.
To show that it is intertwined, both of the stories.
Right. And, some have theorized that if this was a later adaptation, and say it was a text that came from the southern region, they might have used the name Elohim to refer to all of the, the negative aspects of the text where he's asked to sacrifice his own son.
Wouldn't it be crazy if, like, the North story had him sacrifice the child, And then the south story was like, we're going to save him on this one, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. What?
And then he was never talked about again.
Right.
It's like, wow, what happened to him?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What happened to him was God took him.
Yeah.
And apparently Ishmael was his only son then, kind of, except that he threw him into the desert.
Right. So yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's just interesting because you say it like it's a bad story.
It's not a bad story.
Well, it's
child sacrifice is bad.
Right. But it's bad up until the part where where God says, all right, don't actually do that.
Right.
And you're saying that part was written by the South.
It looks like, well, I think the whole story started as a northern tradition, but I think the last editors of the text, which were definitely from the tribe of Judah,
and they would not have liked child sacrifice, so they might have just wrote in a really happy ending.
Well, I think they could have wrote in a happy ending, or when God finally steps in and saves Isaac, they're like, oh, that was Yahweh. If you go far back in history, Elohim and Yahweh were different gods. Elohim was the supreme deity in Canaan, especially in northern Canaan, up towards Phoenicia and Ugarit, and both Baal and some say Yahweh were children of Elohim. The fact of the matter was, at one point in time, Elohim and Yahweh were believed to be two different deities. So, I mean, everyone assumes that Elohim and Yahweh were the same deity, and according to parts of the Bible, they are the same deity. But if you go back to like the time of David or before the time of David, it's very clear through archaeology that the two deities were not the same deity. At one point in time, they became conflated as the same deity in order to combine the northern and the southern tradition. From the biblical point of view, there is only one God, because much of the biblical text was redacted to reflect monotheism. The oldest text of the Bible does not really appear to be monotheistic. Then let's read 6-8.
So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." Then he said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." So the two of them went together.
Right. My first thought reading this was like, I feel like there's a very good chance that line where Abraham's like trying to save face, like, "I'm not going to murder you, son." I wonder if that was added late in the story, and if the original story didn't contain that. But they're like, listen, we can't really make Abraham look like he was going to murder his son. All right, Dan, let's do 9-11. I'll read. Then they came to the place in which God had told them, and Abraham built an altar there and placed wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took a knife to slay his son. What's going through Isaac's mind at this moment?
Hey, I'm going to die. I'm not sure what else would be going through his mind.
Right. The thing about the passage at this moment is, I wonder what was going through each of their minds. As a child, it would be unfathomable to me that my father would sacrifice me. So I'm curious if Isaac was looking in disbelief and horror, or if he was like, "Oh, is this a game? Is this an exercise?"
Well, do we know how old he was?
It doesn't really say. We're kind of given the impression that he was a young boy. He was a lad.
How old is a lad?
12.
So it says that Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. So even at that point, was he still believing that God was going to save his son and that he wouldn't actually have to kill him?
Right. And I had the same question. I was kind of reenacting it in my head, and I thought to myself, do you think he paused at the top?
Right.
Like, did he get the knife up and he's just like, okay.
Yeah.
And he like, now's the time, God. It'd be really great if you would, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I know I would. Like, if I was like, okay, God told me to do this, so I'm doing this, even though I feel like, you know, maybe something else is going to happen. But you get to that last moment and you're like, do I not do it? And at that moment, Abraham has to think, okay, what happens if I bring the knife down?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right.
And then let's say, for example, he brings the knife down and he does kill Isaac. What does it say about Abraham, about what he believes about God?
Right. And how would that look if, you know, God made him kill Isaac?
Right.
I assume his entire household would be like, whoa, I don't want to worship this God.
Well, that was my thought. Okay, let's imagine for a second that God does not stop Abraham from sacrificing his son.
Mm-hmm.
I would have to assume that the whole narrative would fall apart.
Right.
His wife would have to have left him, or like they would never speak again.
Right.
After all she went through, and then you killed the only, like I had this other son and he wasn't good enough, so we sent him away.
Yeah.
So now we just have this one last hope,
right.
And you killed him? I don't know. I feel like the whole household would have been divided.
Yeah. Maybe that's why, I mean, it was just so hard to believe that God would actually have him kill him, that he's like, all right, let's go along with this. I know this isn't real.
But, okay, that brings up a great point. And this is what I always wondered when I was a teenager. Okay, throughout the story, we're led to believe that Abraham doesn't actually believe that God is going to make him sacrifice Isaac. Okay? But then how is that a test of faith?
Right. Yeah, then the whole story is completely pointless, isn't it?
He's basically just walking through the motions saying, okay, at some point in time, God is going to save me from this demand. I'm just doing it because he asked me to, but I really know. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
The most important thing is the thing we don't see, whether he would have actually killed his son.
Right.
And I mean, we'll never know that. I mean, as you said, he's right there about to stab him and God stops him. Right. But was he going to?
Right.
You know?
Right.
And
until the knife gets forward motion.
Yeah.
You know, you don't really know.
Right.
For all we know, he could have paused there at the top for 5 minutes just waiting for the angel of Yahweh to be like, Abraham, don't kill your son.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's intriguing that this is considered a test of faith.
Right.
But faith of what? It seems to me like the story started as a test of obedience. Okay. Not a test of faith, right?
Yeah.
But it's kind of billed as a test of faith. But if anything, it seems to me like this is not a test of any type of faith, but whether or not Abraham is willing to do whatever God tells him to do.
And there's also going to just be things littered in there so that we can read into it. You know, if somebody reads it and says, wow, this God is really bad, we'll be like, oh, no, Abraham knew.
Right.
You know?
That's the feeling to me is like there was a late redaction to the story that is kind of like, no, God wouldn't actually ask anyone to sacrifice their son. Of course that wouldn't happen. Let's read 11 through 12.
All right. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me.
I love how he says, here I am. Mm-hmm. It's a strange English phrase. I know in the original text he doesn't say here I am. He says behold.
And that's better?
I don't know if it's better, but the word behold in English is got a slightly different connotation. Like, you're saying, like, look here.
Yeah.
Looky here.
Like exciting.
Right. It could be that way. It's also, so it seems here that Abraham's just saying, look, I'm right here.
Yeah.
Which is why he says, here I am.
Mm-hmm.
But it's funny because in the literal translation, it would have just said, look. Like, why? I'm right here. Just look at me. You know what I mean? He doesn't really say, here I am. But how else could you translate that? It seems so out of place that the whole time Abraham's talking to God, and then all of a sudden he's talking to the angel of the Lord, which is why so many people be like, oh, well, yeah, that was a later redactor. That was the southern tribes adding their commentary into the story. But I think as a whole, when we look at the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, we can say, okay, this story appears to have originated in the north. And then later pieces of it was redacted. But whether or not we can divide it up verse by verse is anyone's guess.
Right.
Let's read the rest of the narrative.
Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided."
Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven. That's interesting, a second time. And he said, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing, I will bless you, and multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies." Again?
I mean, that's nice of God to continue his promise. He already promised. If Abraham hadn't offered his son, am I to presume that the covenant that God made with Abraham earlier would have been broken? Or did God just really promise the same thing again?
Right. Yeah, because originally, this is the interesting thing about the sacrifice. Originally, God's covenant was for Abraham to walk with God in faith. There was nothing about sacrificing a son. That was part of the covenant specifically. In fact, the covenant was rather vague. So let's say Abraham was like, "No, I'm not going to sacrifice Isaac. That I'm not about that." Like, does that mean he broke the covenant? Because that wasn't really part of it, was it?
I didn't think it was.
Right. But it's interesting to me as well that it is this final test in which God is like, okay, now I know that, you have faith in me and that you're going to do what I need you to do. But how did God not know? Right?
Yeah.
Isn't he supposed to be all knowing, all seeing?
My guess is not yet.
Right. And that's what I feel.
Those traits come along later, I presume, right?
Right.
He gradually gets more power as the books go on.
That's 100% true. He gets more power and he gets more and more removed from humanity.
Right.
Yeah. And that's not just a biblical tradition. That happens all throughout history. God started out as a deity that lived, on the mountaintops. And then he went from the mountaintops to the heavens, and then from the heavens to the high heavens. And then once we discovered that there was no firmament, then they're like, oh, well, he's out in space with the stars. And then once we could explore outer space, we're like, oh, no, he's on a whole different plane of existence.
Yeah, right.
It's like the more we are able to explore and realize God's not there, the more we have to assume that, well, God is in some other location we don't have access to.
Right.
Nevertheless, I don't see this as being necessary to be part of the covenant. God already made a covenant with Abraham.
Right.
Abraham has already agreed to be a party in that covenant. I would have been like, nah, I ain't going to sacrifice my son. We had a covenant. This
Yeah.
wasn't part of it. Sorry that you asked me to do something outside of the covenant, but suck it up, God.
Yeah.
The other thing too, and you brought it up before, it seems strange that like the blessing of Abraham is to multiply his descendants.
Mm-hmm.
Other than the fact that the ancient people practiced a form of ancestor care, meaning they brought provisions to the tombs of their dead ancestors to sustain them in the afterlife.
Oh.
Other than that, I can see of no way in which this actually benefits Abraham.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. It's all about their legacy, right? You know, so it benefits him in so much as he thinks it will benefit him.
I had one thought.
Yeah.
That I'd like to explore a little bit. Yeah, I'm going to read 18 and 19 before I finish my comment on this. It says, "In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. Okay, so it seems like the testing of Abraham is only relevant inasmuch as his faithfulness is able to be passed down genetically. Otherwise, there's no reason whatsoever why his personal faithfulness would matter in why a nation being called and chosen by God should be blessed. This seems to be confirmed in Hebrews 7, which uses Abraham's seed to prove that the priesthood of Melchizedek is greater than that of Levi. I'll read Hebrews 7, 4 through 10, and then I'll finish my comment. "Just think how great he was," referring to Melchizedek. "Even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the plunder. Now the law requires that the descendants of Levi who became the priests to collect a tenth from the people, that is, from their fellow Israelites. Even though they are descendant from Abraham, this man, however, did not trace his descent from Levi. Yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. And without doubt, the lesser is blessed by the greater. In the one case, the tenth is collected by people who die, but in the other case, by him who is declared to be living." This is the important part. "One might even say that Levi, who collects the tenth, paid a tenth through Abraham to Melchizedek, because Melchizedek met Abraham, and Levi was still in the body of his ancestor." Did you catch that? Levi, the royal priesthood that would come later, according to the writer of Hebrews, is still inside of the body of Abraham. Therefore, when Abraham gives the sacrifice to Melchizedek, that means that Melchizedek is an even greater priest than the priests of Levi, because the priests of Levi were in the body of Abraham who gave the offering to Melchizedek. So I say all that to say this: the ancient conception was that all of the people that would ever live from an ancestor were inside of that ancestor. So everybody that ever came from the line of Abraham, they believed, were individually seeds inside of Abraham. And then those seeds get passed genetically, so on and so forth. Now, they didn't really understand what we know today, in which only tiny pieces of genetics get passed down. But they literally believed that all of the descendants of Abraham were within Abraham, which means the only way in which the blessing of the nation of Israel matters in relation to Abraham's faith is inasmuch as perhaps that faith is able to be passed down through his seed. Because otherwise, why do we care if Abraham's faithful or not? We only care if Abraham's children do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right.
Like, God doesn't care if Abraham was faithful. He still needs Abraham's children to follow him.
All right, so if these people knew what we know now, they wouldn't have even written this, right?
Well, it's possible, because theoretically, we know that personality traits are passed down genetically, not perfectly, but they are passed down genetically.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the ancient context here would lead you to believe that it was more of a one-to-one thing. If you were faithful, your offspring would be faithful. Nevertheless, it's hard for me to understand why Abraham's faithfulness has anything to do with the blessing of his offspring.
Right.
What if 5 generations from Abraham, all of his kids are a bunch of... Why are we blessing them? And is that fair? And we see that they're not. We see that the Israelites go astray over and over and over again.
Right.
So why is God not able to know that this is going to be a problem? So Deuteronomy 7:7-9 says, "The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your forefathers, that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery and from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." So it's interesting here that, God is emphasizing that he didn't choose Israel because of anything special. But if we're reading the story of Abraham seriously, I mean, he chose Abraham and made his descendants great because theoretically he passed the test of faith and obedience.
Mm-hmm.
So at what point does it turn to, hey, I'm only saving you stiff-necked people because I told your forefather I would? So I guess if God chose to multiply Abraham's descendants, even though they weren't special and they weren't particularly faithful, well, what in the world is the point of testing Abraham? How does it matter then? His faithfulness at this point to sacrifice his own son outside of the covenant he made with him seems to be a useless exercise. The sacrifice of Isaac could be completely removed from the text, and it would not affect the story at all. In fact, it might improve the story. From a strictly functional standpoint, what does this story do? I can't think of a good reason for this story to exist other than, hey, this was part of the cultural narrative, and we have to include it. And I know there are a lot of people who probably have some answers to like why this story makes sense, but I fail to find why it makes sense in relation to blessing his offspring, which it seems to be that's what this is for. This is specifically the last test before God is like, okay, I'll bless your offspring, even though I already said I would.
Mm-hmm.
I would have loved to hear the alternate rendering of this story where Abraham doesn't sacrifice his child and God's like, well, I already made a covenant. I guess I'll just do the thing I told you I do.
When would you sacrifice your child? When they're a baby, right?
Yeah.
So,
and he's a young boy or a lad.
I mean, this guy's going to run off, right? You think he's really just going to be believing his father when he's got a sword on top of? Maybe this was written beforehand, and Isaac was a baby.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we talked about that last week when they sent Hagar into the desert. The story really feels like Hagar, like Ishmael, is still a toddler of some
and
nature.
Isaac was born after Ishmael, so he would have to be younger.
Right.
So younger than a toddler. We got a little baby here who's going to be sacrificed.
And we don't know how old Isaac is because the story opens with, let's see, it came to pass after these things. It didn't say how long.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, theoretically, even though it says he's a lad, if we believe this to be a northern text, the word lad could have easily been superimposed into the story to make it appear otherwise. Because, as you said, otherwise, if he's 12, almost 13 years old, and his dad's about to sacrifice him, you put a rope around your wrists and get ready to bind him.
Yeah.
No, that any 12-year-old son is like, what are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
You're not sacrificing me.
Right.
I'd fight my dad like crazy if he took me to an altar to make a sacrifice. We had no sacrifice, and he starts like, okay, put your hands behind your back. I'm like, I don't put my hands behind my back. Would be insane.
Yeah.
But according to the Jewish sages, they praised Isaac and said, Isaac was willingly ready to be sacrificed. That's how great of a patriarch he was. That's how great his faith was, that he allowed himself to be bound and ready for sacrifice. I think, obviously, the Jewish sages had to, give some kind of comment.
Make it a little more palatable for the readers, right? Or else they would have been up in arms like, whoa, I don't want to worship this guy.
Well, they had to answer the question, well, how come Isaac didn't fight back? Well, because his faith was so great.
Right, yeah.
You know what I mean?
You know what? Honestly, I think we just blew this case wide open.
Tell me how.
Because it's clear this was before the covenant. And Isaac was a little baby.
I think it's very possible. Yeah. Well, the covenant technically came before Isaac was born.
You know what? It's just making it harder, right?
Nevertheless, let's read 20 through 23 and finish the chapter.
Now it came to pass after these things that it was told to Abraham, saying, indeed, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor, who's his firstborn was his brother Kemuel, the father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel.
I'm so glad I asked you to read this. Oh my goodness. Oh boy.
And Bethuel begot Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. His concubine, whose name was Reumah, also bore Tebah, Gaim, Tahash, and Maachah.
Great.
Perfect.
Great reading.
Thank you.
I think you nailed all of them. I think that this section of text is to explain where Isaac's wife come from.
Well, who's Isaac's wife?
Rebecca.
Oh.
Right.
Oh, that was... Okay.
Right. Who came from the line of Nahor. My impression when I read this was, oh, well, this is just an explanation of where Rebecca came from.
Okay. That makes a lot more sense. I mean, you knew who Isaac's wife was. Right. So this made sense to you. I'm going into this blind, and I'm like, who are all these people, and why do I care?
Right, and that's the funny part, because there's parts of Genesis where you read it, and you're like, this only makes sense if you already know all of these traditions.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or else you're like, well, what is this?
I feel like this was written for people who already read this.
It is. That's why there's so many people are quick to point out that a lot of sections of the text look like they were added later to the text, like the lineages.
Mm-hmm.
Those were probably added later by the priestly traditions, where your lineage was quite important.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, at some point in time, they took these narratives, and people were like, oh, I can't remember who came from who. Or what? So they're like, okay, look, we're just going to put in the family line right here. Mm-hmm. That way it's there. Mm-hmm. People don't have to keep asking. All right, that's all for this week. Remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week. Yeah, I forgot to write down notes.
What?
To like the rest of this.
Oh, great.
Until the end.
Then Abraham lifted... Question withdrawn.
All right, we'll just cut that.
And...
Excuse me, sorry.
Yeah, we'll cut that out.
You'll cut that out.
Wow.